I may be the most censored artist in the world, and you've never heard of me, because I paint for working people who are engaged in social struggles that are fundamentally challenging the status quo. Red Square began first with the mural, "The City at the Crossroads of History," that was censored. It was supposed to go to the Museum of the City of New York to be installed in a gallery about social activism paid for by the Puffin Foundation. They approached me and asked me to create this piece. And written and verbal assurances were given that the work would be installed. An authoritative advisory committee gave unanimous and enthusiastic approval to my sketches. Then museum director Susan Henshaw Jones, who is directly tied in to the financial interests of the city, refused to install the work. Sadly, the Puffin Foundation and all the members of the advisory committee meekly acquiesced to the censorship of the mural. Fear of funders is a fact of life, and the incident received virtually no notice in the progressive or art media. The silence is a revealing example of how liberal philanthropy is used to dampen social struggles and preserve the status quo. You will find another example of this right next to the city in the form of the dreams of Harriet Tubman, which we'll talk about later. Anyway, I created the mural on canvas panels instead of my usual working on site because I was afraid that such a thing would happen. And that's the only reason the work exists, and that's why it hangs in Red Square. While the title of the work references Diego Rivera's mural at Rockefeller Center, which was called Man at the Crossroads, and which was destroyed by Nelson Rockefeller, the inspiration actually comes from an important painting of a much earlier time, The Garden of Earthly Delights, a triptych by Hieronymus Bosch completed in 1504. With the rise of capitalism, Bosch looked nostalgically to the feudal past, issuing visual warnings about the oncoming excesses of capitalist greed. But while Bosch's great vision came to life at the dawn of capitalism, I was painting during the twilight. Today, the rule of capital is unraveling. Today's capitalists are characterized by a lack of vision and a culture of self-indulgence and commodity fetishism unsurpassed by their predecessors. Less than 100 super-rich individuals own as much as the poorest half of the planet, more than they can conceivably spend, yet with an unquenchable thirst for ever more. As they march us toward a carbon-based extinction or nuclear annihilation, their press and airwaves dumb us down. They feed us a diet of poison for mind and body. For them, art is but a commodity for investment and self-aggrandizement. The pervasive fear that haunts us is the symptom of a cancerous system. Capitalism is in a profound economic and social crisis. It is a dying empire. The mural is composed of 4 panels. In the top 3 sections of the mural, I transposed Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, portraying a garden that's not about erotic leisures, activities, but the field of social struggle, from which all the fruits of social change have grown. We're going to begin with the upper left section of the mural, which is called the Hell of Exploitation. It focuses on the pillars that the vast wealth of the United States was created. Extermination of the indigenous people, the Holocaust of African enslaved labor, and the evils of the capitalist system based on child labor, the exploitation of women, racism, and the other atrocities of capitalism. I've placed the image of the slave ship as it arrives at the foot of Wall Street. Wall Street Wharf was the original ingress for slave ships into the city. The enormous wealth generated by exploiting millions of enslaved Africans provided the capital for the rapid expansion of the U.S. financial empire. It was a brutal holocaust of 12 million Africans transported in chains to the U.S., with additional millions that died in the process. After the formal abolition of chattel slavery, fortunes continued to grow through the brutal exploitation of African Americans in near slave-like conditions. For much of the country, such conditions existed until the advent of the modern civil rights movement, just a few decades ago. The vast prison industrial complex that exists today and that enslaves over 1 million African Americans is both a threat and a constant reminder of that reality. The hanging figures of lynched African Americans reminds us of the widespread and terrifying use of lynch mob violence, a reign of terror that had the active support or quiet acceptance of both major parties and most of their central leaders. In the center is the image of Ota Benga, and it represents the racist heritage that underpins the world's leading cultural institutions. He was a Congolese Mobutu pygmy who was kidnapped from Africa and placed in the Bronx Zoo monkey house in 1906. Such dehumanizing exhibitions of indigenous peoples were created as popular amusements. The image of colonists in New Amsterdam with the heads of indigenous peoples on their pikes is a reminder that westward expansion did not take place in an empty land, but at the cost of the near extermination of thriving civilizations. Child laborers that worked under inhumane conditions during most of U.S. history were a linchpin of capital accumulation. The burning Triangle Shirtwaist Company building, with women in flames leaping to their deaths, should require little motivation to understand the brutality of wage exploitation, particularly of immigrant workers, that provided the luxurious lifestyle of the wealthy. And at the top of the panel are the super rich, revealed in all their commodity fetishism. A ruling class that is so blinded by greed that they will literally destroy the planet in pursuit of ever greater profits, when they are incapable of physically spending what they have now. An insatiable, self-perpetuating military machine that thrives on the blood of our young people protects this system of gross inequality. It is so bloated that it robs our elderly of a secure retirement, our children of an education, and our poor of a nutritious diet. The U.S. spends almost as much money on war making as all other countries in the world combined. The center panel is called The March of the People and gives expression to the history of social struggles that led to social and economic advances for working people. Organizing unions, the anti-war movement, civil rights, the black nationalist struggle, international solidarity, women's suffrage, gay rights, etc. It represents the great march of humanity. It is the coming together of centuries of struggle, the shared sacrifice and joy that arises when we enter the street, join the picket, carry the banner, and otherwise become part of a collective expression of humanity that goes beyond individual rebellion. Visually, as well as politically, a mass of human beings engaged in struggle together becomes something far more powerful than the sum of the individual participants. A new consciousness develops, a sense of the collective potential power that we possess. The march is inclusive and gives voice to events that may provide new revelations to the viewer, that the motor force of social change is not the great leader, but the movement of millions. Beginning in the upper left-hand corner, we will see the first of what amounts to a little synopsis of social struggles in New York. It is not complete by any means. We begin with the overthrow of the monarchy, the tearing down of the statue by the earliest rebellion against monarchy. We see the indigenous people and indigenous women who were part of opposition to the extermination and attempts to preserve the culture of indigenous people. There are pickets from early strikes. There are a mass of African Americans marching in Black Power movements, coming to hear Malcolm X speaking in New York. We also see one of the most profound social movements that has ever existed, the anti-Vietnam War movement, and in particular, the support to anti-war GIs who are instrumental in ending the war. In the very background, we can see maritime pickets, part of the social struggles that went on when New York as a port city had active and progressive unions. Moving forward, we can see lady strikers, lady pickets. Many of the textile workers were immigrant workers, in particular Jewish workers, at a time when Jews formed a very progressive section of the working class movement. We also can see fights against segregation in sports, in schools. Going back further, we can see struggles by local communities against landlordism through rent strikes and other actions designed to fight for decent housing. In the very back, we see Cooper Union during a struggle of fight for free tuition. Going forward, there's an active view of the Puerto Rican liberation struggle, which formed a part of the working class struggle both on the island and in New York. On the right-hand side, we begin with women on a boat who are part of the fight for the right to vote. To their right is a scene from the Patterson Silk Strike, the Patterson Silk Strike pageant that was held at Madison Square Garden. In an amazing example of working class culture, striking workers, textile workers, who are part of a union struggle of over 24 nationalities, all speaking different languages, who united in solidarity, marched across the bridge to New York, onto the stage of Madison Square Garden, and reenacted scenes of the strike in a great pageant, a great theatrical event. Above them, IWW was spelled out in electric lights, the industrial workers of the world, an early attempt at mass organization that had a profound effect on the culture and politics of this country, led free speech fights, organizing events, and created an incredible working class culture. To their right are marchers defending reproductive rights. In front of them are Woolworth strikers, women who led sit-down strikes that shut down the Woolworths and were part of a massive wave of sit-down strikes that led to the formation of industrial unions in the U.S. If we come forward, on the left, we get public workers marching. Public workers, government workers, teachers led important strikes, many as late as the 1970s, in order to preserve their unions or establish unions. On the right-hand side is Stonewall. The Stonewall Rebellion, the events at Stonewall laid the basis for the modern gay rights movement, which in turn led to other movements and offshoots that totally transformed the ideas of sexuality in our culture and expanded the bounds of what is permissible and destroyed much of the ancient macho reactionary credos that existed. And in the center, we see a big banner that says Solidarity Forever, because it's through the solidarity of these social movements, it's through the social movement support to each other that we are able to fight and we are able to win. On the upper right, the panel is entitled, Another World is Possible. Recalling Vladimir Tatlin's monument to the Third Communist International, two mighty workers' hands arise from scaffolding and reach to the heavens, holding bread and roses. Bread symbolizes the material basis for a decent life. Today, humanity processes the material capability to feed, clothe, and educate every human being on the planet. We are prevented from doing so by oppressive cultural and political structures. Roses represents the working class aspiration for a meaningful spiritual and cultural existence, that our lives are not simply meant to work. Tatlin's Tower was one of the modern art's great visionary works, designed to be the highest structure on earth, intended to serve as the headquarters for global revolutionary struggle. The panel attempts to evoke the ideas that working people can build their own future, whatever that may be. Workers produce socially. We are no longer individual craftspeople or tillers of small plots of land. Our place in society entails working to produce collectively. It's this resultant cooperation that lays the basis for the combative spirit that characterizes the working class. This panel looks ahead with optimism. The world's armaments have been buried, and workers of different nations no longer slaughter each other on the field of battle. Instead, they strive to be in accord with nature, accepting and appreciating the beautiful planet that we inhabit. Workers can live in harmony with nature, sharing a piece of the pie. We no longer have a world where some individuals possess vast wealth and power by accident of birth, and others live under brutal backward conditions. Here, we are all constructing a new future, and everyone is expected and allowed to participate. Finally, the bottom section of the mural is entitled, We Follow the Path Less Traveled. These are almost life-size figures of 30 of New York's historic leading social and labor activists. A few, such as Martin Luther King and John Lennon, are well known and recognizable. But there are also those that rarely, if ever, have been portrayed in public art. A. Philip Randolph, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Marcus Garvey, Big Bill Haywood, and others. Many of these individuals went to jail or gave their lives for our movement and should not be hidden from view. We've been so robbed of our history that many of these figures remain unknown to us. Some were immigrants or visitors to New York. Some were workers, intellectuals, or artists. Others were born to wealth and privilege. They're nationalists, syndicalists, anarchists, socialists, communists, and liberals. There are wage workers and ex-chattel slaves. There are railroad workers, miners, shipbuilders, textile workers, and musicians. There are Christians, Jews, Muslims, and atheists. They are African, European, Asian, Latino, and from many other origins. Some were martyred in the struggle, others were vilified, and many spent considerable time in prison. Beginning on the left, the group includes A. Philip Randolph, the labor and civil rights activist, the great Mexican muralist Diego Rivera, and the artist-activist Frida Kahlo. There's the Puerto Rican nationalist leader and political prisoner, Pedro Obizo Campos. There's Margaret Sanger, who was an early reproductive rights activist. And Mabel Dodge, who was a free-thinking patron of the arts and supporter of democratic rights. Below her is Grace Lee Boggs, who was an important feminist and Marxist activist. Moving towards the right is John Lennon, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who was what the industrial workers of the world called a jawsmith. That is, she was a great agitator, a founder of the ACLU, a feminist and communist. Above to the right is Harry Haywood. He was a sailor, communist, and black nationalist theoretician. In front is Eugene Debs. He was a railroad strike leader, presidential candidate for the Socialist Party while imprisoned in opposition to World War I. When he ran, it was to vote for prisoner 9653. And above his shoulder is Daniel De Leon, the great socialist orator and leader of the Socialist Labor Party. Front and center are Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King. They belong in the streets of New York as much as anywhere else in the country. And the same is true of Malcolm X, who gave voice to the black community of New York City. Between them, Hubert Harrison was a West Indian intellectual and a leading voice of Harlem radicalism. As we move to the right, Clara Lemlich was a young Jewish garment worker, a rank-and-file leader of the 1909 uprising of the 20,000 textile workers' strike. Frederick Douglass was an ex-slave and ship's caulker, a leading voice of the abolitionist movement. Che Guevara was an Argentinian physician, leader of the Cuban Revolution, anti-apartheid fighter in Southern Africa, and a vibrant voice of internationalism. Bayard Rustin was a labor, civil rights, and gay activist. Marcus Garvey was a leading voice of black nationalism, a founder and leader of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. To their right, Carlo Tresca was an anarchist leader in the Italian workers' immigrant community and the IWW. Sojourner Truth was an early feminist, escaped slave, conductor on the Underground Railroad, and abolitionist. Emma Goldman was an anarchist propagandist and activist. Big Bill Haywood was a leader of the Western Federation of Miners and the IWW. The bottom section, this march of activists from our history, is intended to be a photo backdrop. Visitors to the mural can have their pictures taken as they march along with this grand army. What characterizes all of these individuals was their shared belief that the actions of working people in their masses could change society in a fundamental way. They proved that in struggle. This brief introduction does not really give a sense of these rich lives. For that, you really need to do some research and reading and learn about this hidden history. This mural is a magical vision, but art is a magical process in the sense that it frees us to imagine new possibilities. The city at the crossroads of history presents an optimistic vision of the future. Today we stand at a critical juncture in history. Events like the Gulf oil disaster and the Fukushima nuclear meltdown have provided graphic evidence of how close we stand to a catastrophe that threatens the very existence of humanity. The carbon-based foundation of modern capitalism threatens untold numbers of species with extinction, including our own. Inter-imperialist rivalries pose the possibility of a global conflagration that would end life as we know it. Fortunately, there are new waves of activism arising to provide fresh visions and alternatives to the deepening social and economic crisis. The largest anti-war demonstrations in human history did not occur during the 1970s, but in February 2003, preceding the U.S. invasion of Iraq, including in New York City. The largest working class conscious demonstrations in the United States was not during the 1930s, but in the immigrant workers' mobilizations of May Day 2006, proclaiming, "We are workers, we are not criminals." The largest political discussions did not occur during earlier waves of radicalization and activism, but around recent upheavals like Occupy, Tahrir Square, and Black Lives Matter. The internet, created as a tool for the military, has been occupied by millions of workers engaged in an unprecedented discussion and debate about how we can build a new world. Collectively, we possess the power to bring that world to birth.